Caching with donuts is helpful when caching an entire page is overkill. And you have two basic options with this way of thinking about caching pages. The first is donut caching. So in this case, you cache the page, but generate portions of it every time, the holes. And then the other option is donut hole caching, where you cache only specific portions of a page, but then each time dynamically generate the page as a whole. So it's only the donut holes that are getting cached for whatever period of time that you set. All right, so donut caching. So this is a server-side caching technique. So it caches the entire page except for portions, which are the holes. Now one problem here is that the Razor View engine doesn't support donut caching natively. The core problem is that there's nothing equivalent to the web forms substitution control. This is a server-side control that you drop into a page. And when you do that, the control registers a callback event in the output cache, which invokes a static method on the page when the cached page is requested. So when the page is requested, the cached page is returned, and ASP.NET calls the callback method to provide the non-cached portions of the page. The good news, though, is that even though MVC doesn't have a substitution control like that, you can still make use of the substitution APIs within an MVC application. These APIs are built into ASP.NET, so they're available at MVC as well. They just don't have that server-side control to support them. But you can easily create a custom HTML helper method to provide the same functionality as that substitution control if you want to. And people have certainly done that. You can find examples of it out on the interwebs. And if you do that, you want to take advantage of the HTTP responses write substitution method. Okay, but a better option is the MVC donut caching NuGet package. This is available for MVC 3 and later. Nice thing is that it's free and it's widely used. And what it does is it extends the action and render action HTML helper methods, adding a Boolean final parameter that indicates whether the output of the helper method should be excluded from the parent view's cache. The way all this works is generally the same as when you use output caching to cache an entire view, returning the cached object on subsequent calls until the object expires or is removed. But donut caching takes some extra steps. When caching the page, it needs to identify the areas that we don't want to cache, the donut holes, and marking them so that when the page is retrieved from the cache, we can replace those areas with non-cached data, or HTML or whatever, before returning them to the client. What makes all this hard in MVC is that the ASP.NET page caching features implement full and partial page caching differently, which makes it hard to extend the existing features to support donut caching. But the nice thing about the MVC donut caching package is that its authors solved those problems, in part by providing a donut output cache attribute that you use instead of just the plain output cache attribute. That way, internally, they hook into what works in ASP.NET caching and replaces what doesn't with new code. It really is a very slick solution, and you can read about the details on the project's GitHub page and the related blog. And if you really want to dig into the details, the full source code is available to anyone. The attribute supports most of the regular output caching attribute parameters, including cache profiles and the vary-by parameters. And you can introduce the donut holes by using the overloaded forms of the action and render action HTML helper methods. Okay, so long explanation, let's take a look at how all this works within an application. All right, the first thing I need to do in order to use that MVC donut caching package within my project is install it. So to do that, I would come here to Tools and select the Library Package Manager. Now, if you're not familiar with NuGet packages, it's definitely a thing to learn about within Visual Studio. It's a very slick way of installing features into applications, and there's a lot of packages that you can use with MVC4. All right, there's a couple options. I can use the Package Manager console, which is essentially a command line tool, or I can use this GUI interface, Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. So I'll do that, and I'll want to select Online, and then search for MVC donut. This helps to spell it right. Donut caching, and hit Enter. And there's the option right there. And you can see I already have it installed for the project. But if I didn't, I could select it here. There would be a little Install button. And that would add all of the assemblies and configure the project for using donut caching. Okay. Otherwise, I can come over here to Installed Packages, search for the same thing, and there we have it. And there you can manage it and uninstall it and whatever. Okay. So it's already installed, but that's what you need to do in order to use that within a project. And when you install it, I can look here in Solution Explorer and under References, and it adds this devtrends.mvc donut caching reference. Okay, so that makes it available for use. So I'll go ahead and run the application, then we'll look at the code. So here's the donut caching page. And as you can see, I have a whole bunch of times surrounded by other times. This is the first time I've loaded the page, so everything is in sync. So here's the donut. All this stuff is the donut, and this is the donut hole. And I'll refresh the page. And as you can see, the only thing being dynamically generated is the donut hole. And I even put it in the middle. Get it? Donut hole. It's surrounded by other stuff. Ha ha ha. All right, so you can see how it's working. And as you can also see, this is the page time. So this is cached, just like the rest of the data on the page. But then I have a fresh time, so this is not cached. And everything is cached for 10 seconds, so you see that every 10 seconds they get resynced again. Okay, so that's how the donut caching works. Again, the entire page is cached except for little holes that you define, one or more holes. All right, so here's the code that does that. So I just have donut caching, and I return the view. Take a look at that view before we talk about the other. So here's the page. Okay, so I created a table. I have all of these cached values, and then I have the one cell in the middle that calls that action method, get fresh time. And then I also call get fresh time right there. So what identifies the holes is this true value right there. So this is what was added by virtue of the fact that I added the MVC donut caching package to this project. So it's an extension of the built-in HTML action helper method. Okay, and back over to the home controller, this is what makes it happen. So instead of using the output cache parameter, I'm using the donut output cache and setting it to the duration, and you can use the other parameters that are supported by output cache as well. But in this case, I'm just caching it for 10 seconds. Okay, and so we can do things like come back over here, right-click on this, and go to the definition. And you can see that under this devtrends MVC donut caching namespace, we have the various helper method extensions that include those Boolean values as the last parameter. Now you can see that there's various options that support all of the overloaded methods of the action helper method and the render action helper method. So basically, every overload is overloaded again with that final exclude from parent cache method. A very slick way of implementing these features. The MVC donut caching package really is the way to implement donut caching in MVC4. It supports more advanced scenarios than you'd likely implement with just a custom HTML helper. Now let's talk about donut hole caching. This is the inverse of donut caching. Donut caching caches the entire page except for one or more small holes. With donut hole caching, you only cache one or more small holes. You really kind of get the impression that the developers who named these things had low blood sugar at the time. Okay, so you only cache one or a few small portions of the page. So you want to use this when most of the page is dynamic and fast changing. You just need to keep it up to date anytime the user requests the page. But there are little bits that are relatively fixed and have a high processing overhead to regenerate. What's really nice here is that MVC 4 natively supports donut hole caching, and the mechanism is with child actions. And so what you do is you just use the output cache attribute on the child action. So I really want to impress. For this scenario, you don't need to install anything special. It's in MVC right out of the box. All right, I'll start the application again and look at donut hole caching. So there we have the same basic page as the donut caching, but now when I refresh it, the overall page changes, but the donut hole doesn't, except for after 10 seconds. So I think the donut holes are cached for 10 seconds. So you can see 35, 36, 38, 39, and the holes got updated. All right, so you can see how it's the inverse of donut caching. So real simple to implement. So here's the donut hole caching. So that just returns the view. We take a look at that view. So it looks pretty similar to the donut caching page, including I'm calling this get hole time. I'm using a different action method there, but I'm calling that action method to get the time. All the other times within the page are being retrieved just directly using the toLong time string on the dateTimeNow object. Overall construction is pretty similar. What's different here is that instead of caching this parent method, remember for donut caching, I cached this method here using the donut output cache. I'm not caching this action method. Instead, I'm caching the child method. And in fact, I'm marking it as child action only, so it can't be called directly. And in this case, I'm just using the regular output cache method, not the overloaded, nothing special, not the donut version of it or anything. And so that's how I get that effect. So you can see how this has built-in support within MVC 4.